Hey, thanks for stopping by. Today I've got to do a bunch of metallic leatherette patches. And for any of you that have messed with the leatherette, when you're engraving to it, the metallics can be the trickiest. And so what I thought I'd do is I'd share some tips and tricks that I've learned to make sure that you can go ahead and get these produced. I'm going to be doing the silver, or the blue to silver, the black to silver, and the rustic to gold today. And I will tell you, at least from my experience, that the gold color is by far the trickiest. It's not very consistent. And so the things that I've learned is when you're doing these leatherette metallics, the smaller, thinner designs are pretty inconsistent, and sometimes you've got to approach those just a little bit differently than you would if you were using the leatherette that engraves to black. And so I'll show you kind of how I approach it. I will also link a video in the description along with up top if you're having trouble determining the settings on your leatherette. We're not going to talk about that today. What we're really going to focus in on is when you engrave a metallic or even a black and you're looking at the artwork, what is that artwork telling you? Do you have not enough power? Do you have too much power? And which way do you need to go? One of the first things that I will tell you when it comes to engraving leatherette, whether it's to engraving to black or to the metallics, is when you're dialing in your settings, you want to be very meticulous about increasing or decreasing your power in very small increments. The reason being is that the leatherette in general has a very narrow power band on the sweet spot and where it really looks good. And so if you go, if you jump too high, like if you go from a 16 to a 17% or a 17 to an 18%, you could actually blow right past the sweet spot and never really get it dialed in. So one of the first things that I'm going to tell you is when you're fine-tuning your settings for your particular laser, take very small increments. Typically I'll go from like 16 to 16 and a quarter to 16 and a half to 16 and 3/4 in quarter percentage increments, and you'll almost always be able to find that sweet spot. But that's the key. The other thing that I will tell you is if you have small or narrow graphics, a lot of the leatherette is going to struggle with that, and it just depends on whether you're doing a raster image or you're doing an actual vector. That will make a difference, and we'll talk a little bit about some artificial stitching that I'm doing on these patches where the customer doesn't want the pre-done patches. They want the lasered on so it looks like stitching on that. I'll show you how to do that today. It's pretty easy, but there's some things that you're going to have to consider when you do that. So anyway, we'll just play with this leatherette a little bit, primarily the metallic, and see if we can get this thing dialed in. I'll share some of the tips and tricks that I've learned, and let's go get her done. One of the other things that I do is I always defocus my lens when I'm engraving leatherette. Whether it's the sheet stock or the pre-done patches, I'm always 1 to 2 millimeters out of focus. This makes a big difference on just about any leatherette that I do. So keep that in mind. You want to defocus that lens, get that laser beam just a little bit bigger, and it will help you with determining where the sweet spot is in your leatherette. The other thing that I will tell you is when you're looking at designs to do on leatherette in general, you want to stay away from real fine, narrow designs. Your success rate will go way up if you stay with a little bit bigger, bolder designs, at least initially until you get this stuff figured out, because it can be tricky. The thinner, the finer detail that you have that you're trying to put on leatherette, it can be very tricky, and in some cases, you're just not going to get it to look right. So keep that in mind. Let's go to the table and I'll show you what I got. Okay, so this is the black to silver, and we started with 400 millimeters per second at 16% power. And you can see that we've got places in this text these narrow spots right here, the end of the E, around where the corner of the G is, this area in here, you can see where they're not quite engraved. They're not easily read, and this isn't what you want. This part of the E isn't even finished. This typically, as long as you're not seeing black within the silver, it means that your power is not quite where it needs to be. It needs to be increased just a little bit. Now this is at 16%. I went to 16 1/4, didn't see much difference. I went to 16 1/2, and that's what you see here. You can see the difference between 16% here and 16 1/2% here. You can see now we've got the E is finished out nice. We've got a nice clean line for the bottom of the G. The part of the E is finished here. You've got the top of the T is engraved nicely. And so this is a 0.5 percentage in power difference between this and this. Then I went from 16 1/2% to 17%, which is only a 0.5%. And you can see now it's starting to fall apart. You can see that we've got some dark in the middle of the engraving, and that's typically a sign that you've got too much power. You're going right through the silver and into the backing. And so typically, the biggest way I've found that you can find on whether you're too high or too low in your power is if your letters or your designs aren't quite engraved, it's leaving some of the things out, your power is too low. If it's too high, you're going to start to see these dark areas in the middle of the where the silver is going to be. And this is the same for whether it's gold or it's silver. It doesn't much matter. I will say that gold is a little bit more sensitive compared to silver, but it still works the same. But you can see the difference. If we started at 16 and we went to 17, we would have blown right past the sweet spot. This seems to be the perfect setting. Now I'm on a 60 watt and it's 400 millimeters per second at 16.5% power. And I'm focused at about 8 millimeters where my normal focus distance is 6 millimeters. So I'm out of focus 2 millimeters. And you can even see that the little hash marks that I put around this is very readable. This is pretty good. And then if I would have let this run, I didn't want to burn up too much leatherette, but you can see that the hash marks around actually has a black mark in the middle of it and doesn't look very good. So if you're getting dark in the middle of your designs, that's too much power. If your designs aren't being finished and etched properly, especially the narrow parts, it's not enough power. And this is what your sweet spot should look like. That's a good indicator. And even on regular leatherette that engraves to black will do the same thing. It's a little bit more forgiving, meaning that your power band is a little bit wider when you engrave to black. If you're using leatherette that goes from like a bamboo to a black or a blue to a black, something like that, the blacks are quite a bit easier to deal with. But this metallic stuff is pretty tricky. But this is a perfect example of where we started, we hit the sweet spot, we went too far. And so if you look, let me zoom in here if I can. You can see here, this part is not even finished at all compared to this right here where it's nice and lasered. Big difference, and there's only a 0.5 percentage in power between this one and this one. Here's another great example on some bamboo to black. This is not a metallic, but the things that I had talked about previously still ring true. You can see that the end of this E right here is not finished on both E's. And so I need to put just a little bit more power to this design in order to get this E finished up. And but the perforation looks pretty good. I could probably put a little bit more power and actually do 2 passes on this perforation compared to 1. It'll make it a little bit darker. Again, when you're engraving leatherette to a black, it's quite a bit more forgiving, meaning that you can go in bigger jumps in your power typically, and it won't fall apart on you as much as the metallic will. So again, even if you're doing the leatherette to black, the rules still apply. If your designs aren't getting finished, it's typically because you're still not at that sweet spot, and you need to add just a little bit more power. When it comes to patches that aren't the pre-sewn leatherette patches, but the customer wants it to look like there's a little bit of a stitch on the perimeter of your patch, I use a perforation mode on that, and it seems to work out pretty good. So you don't want to raster the perforation mode, meaning go back and forth. You actually want to just offset the cut line and use what they call perforation mode and make this a line. So this is actually a vector that the laser engraves, and it goes around each one. The other thing that I will tell you is that I've had better luck when I do this perforation mode is to turn the power down and do 2 passes instead of 1. Works really well on the engraved to black stuff. That's excellent. The metallic stuff, you got to kind of be careful. So the way I usually do these perforations is if it's metallic, it's 1 pass. If it's the engraving to the black, I usually do 2 passes, and it shows up really well. So I'll show you where the perforation mode is, what my settings are as far as skip and cut, and these work out really well. I enjoy using the perforation mode because in a lot of cases you might not be able to get the patches that you want that are pre-done, and this way you can just cut them out of a sheet and make them like they've got some stitches. So if you're interested on how I do the perforation or the simulated lace work around this patch, I make it a separate layer. So you've got the engraved layer for the village, and then I've got a separate offset line, and I change it a different layer, and I come in here. It's a line, it's 400 millimeters per second. It's at 15% power, which is a little bit less. And if I open this layer up, you're going to see, as long as you're in line mode, you should have the ability to turn the perforation mode on. And when you do that, you've got to make a setting for cut and skip. And so the settings that I normally use, and this is a great place for at least for you to start, and then you can adjust it to your liking, is 0.10 for the cut and 0.05 for the skip. And that seems to replicate the lace work pretty good. Play with your own settings, but the perforation mode's a lot of fun to use. I will tell you, because it's a vector, you'll probably want to reduce your power compared to what you've been engraving your leatherette at. And so again, this is something that you're just going to have to play with, but usually it's just a little bit less than what you're engraving your normal artwork on the leatherette portion. So that's how you get the perforated look. Hope that's helpful. Here's a different logo on rustic to silver. It's my logo, and you can see that the general part of the graphic looks great, but you can see right here on the top of the T and the E, and over here, I'm on the very edge of having too much power. Now, the way that I found to deal with this, where you have a nice big blocky logo, no problem, piece of cake, easy to do, and then you come into some fairly fine text, what I found is I actually make this text a separate layer, and I don't fill it, I don't raster engrave it, I actually turn it into a line and vector engrave it and turn the power down. And it seems to work out pretty well, especially if you have fine or close text like this. So don't be afraid to try some vector engrave or some vector work on your leatherette. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. Here's another good example where this part of it looks good, and what I did is I actually vectorized or used a line mode for my business name, and it came out much better, much cleaner, much easier to read. If you'd see the difference between that and the vector just looks muddy. It's not crisp and clean. So the rules still apply, meaning that if you got little tiny stuff, you're gonna have to figure out what you need to do here. You can see that I might have put in just a little bit more power to finish this point right here. This one's finished, but that one is not. I could probably put just a little bit more power on this design. But again, what I'm trying to do is kind of show you, based on what you're seeing for an output, what you can do to make your graphics look better. I hope this information was helpful, and as always, if you guys would please like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Everybody having a great day.